The morning Imani Caldwell dropped her pen, the entire courtroom heard it hit the marble floor. Not because the room was quiet, because she stopped breathing. Across the room, behind the defense table, sat the man who had looked her in the eyes 5 years ago and told her she deserved better than him, then walked away without ever knowing he had left her carrying his child. Seo Do-hwan, 41 years old, billion-dollar shipping empire, and the most feared Korean mafia boss operating along the entire Pacific coast. He turned, their eyes met, and in that single, suspended second, Imani understood that the case she had spent 11 months building, the case that was supposed to define her career, had just become the most dangerous thing she had ever done in her life. If you've ever had to face someone who shattered you while pretending you're completely fine, you already know exactly what this feels like. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because we release stories like this every week and you do not want to miss what happens next. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Imani Caldwell had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in 11 months. That was not a complaint. That was just the math of what it took to build a federal prosecution from scratch against a man whose entire financial structure had been designed by people who understood, at a fundamental level, that paper trails were only dangerous if someone was patient enough to follow them all the way to the end. She was patient enough. She had always been patient enough. It was the thing her supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's office respected about her, and the thing her ex-boyfriend Marcus had called cold the night before he packed his bags and told her he couldn't compete with her caseload for her attention. She hadn't argued. She'd gone back to her files. That was 3 years ago. She didn't miss him. She missed sleep. She missed sitting down to dinner before 8 o'clock. She missed the version of herself that could read a novel without mentally annotating it for narrative inconsistencies. But mostly on the mornings when Zuri climbed into her bed at 6 a.m. and pressed her small warm face against Imani's shoulder, she missed having someone to share that moment with. She never said that out loud. There was no point in saying things you couldn't change. The case file that landed on her desk 11 months ago was labeled Haniel Pacific Financial Crimes Division. 340 pages of initial documentation. Shell companies registered across 7 countries. Investment funds that accepted money from ordinary families in Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, and Sacramento, promising stable returns connected to the booming Pacific shipping industry, and then systematically drained those accounts through a layered series of subsidiary transfers that ended, always, somewhere offshore. The man at the center of the empire was identified in the early documentation only as the principal controlling party. Imani had built her case around the structure, not the man. That was how she always worked. Follow the money until the money leads you to a person, and by the time you arrive at the person, you have everything you need to make the charge stick. She had arrived. She was ready. She walked into courtroom 7 on a gray Seattle Tuesday morning with her briefcase in her left hand and a coffee she hadn't finished in her right, and she was already mentally running through her opening argument, checking the order of her exhibits, calculating the likely demeanor of juror number 4, who had a tendency to look skeptical whenever financial documents appeared on the screen. She set her briefcase on the prosecution table. She reached into the side pocket for her pen, and then she made the mistake of glancing across the room. The pen slipped from her fingers. She heard it hit the floor. She did not pick it up. Seo Do-hwan sat behind the defense table in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His posture, the kind of controlled stillness that didn't come from money. It came from years of discipline in the presence of people who were watching for weakness. His attorneys flanked him on both sides. He was not looking at his legal team. He was not looking at the bench. He was not studying the jury box, which was what most defendants did in the first minutes of a trial, whether they admitted it or not. He was looking at her. She didn't know how long he had been looking at her. Long enough to see her drop the pen. For 3 full seconds, Imani Caldwell, federal prosecutor, single mother, The woman who had not flinched presenting evidence in front of a federal judge at 31 years old could not move. Then Do-hwan's expression shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. It would not have registered to anyone watching from the gallery. His jaw tightened by perhaps 2 millimeters. A small tension appeared at the outer corner of his left eye. His hands, which had been folded on the table in front of him, went absolutely still, in the way that hands go still when the person they're attached to is fighting very hard not to react. He recognized her. Of course he recognized her. She made herself bend down and pick up the pen. She made herself set it on the table. She made herself pull out her chair and sit down and open her briefcase and remove the first exhibit packet and place it in order in front of her. Her hands were not shaking. She was proud of that. The Honorable Patricia Wynn entered the courtroom at 9:03, and Imani rose with everyone else and made herself focus on the bench, and when the judge called the case and asked if both parties were ready, Imani said clearly, and without hesitation, "The prosecution is ready, Your Honor." She did not look at Do-hwan again for the rest of the morning session. She didn't need to. She could feel exactly where he was in the room. 5 years is a long time to pretend you made peace with something. Imani had worked very hard at that pretending. She was good at it, the same way she was good at most things, through effort and repetition and refusing to examine the parts of the process that cost her the most. She had met Seo Do-hwan during a corporate financial investigation she was consulting on in San Francisco. She was 29. He was 36. She was introduced to him at a meeting involving 3 other attorneys and a compliance officer. And the thing she remembered most clearly about that first moment was not his appearance, but the way he listened absolute, undivided attention, like every word anyone spoke was a data point he was storing for later use. She had found it unsettling and impressive in equal measure. The investigation had nothing to do with him. He was tangentially connected to one of the companies under review through a legitimate shipping contract, and after 2 interviews with her team, he was cleared of any relevant involvement. That should have been the end of it. He had called her 3 days later and asked if she would have dinner with him. She told him that was professionally inappropriate. He pointed out that she was no longer conducting the investigation and that he was no longer a subject of any interview. Technically, he said, we are simply 2 people who have met. She had gone to dinner. She had tried afterward to explain to her friend Dija why she had done something that was completely out of character for her. The best she could come up with was that he asked questions other people never thought to ask, and when she answered them, she never felt like she was performing the version of herself she usually performed in public. With Do-hwan, for reasons she never fully understood, she had felt like she could say something unfinished, and he would hold it carefully while she figured out what she actually meant. That lasted 4 months. They never defined what it was. He didn't do that. She learned quickly. He existed in the relationship with precision and focus, and something that functioned like warmth, but he didn't attach labels to things, and she had convinced herself, for 4 months, that she was fine with that. She wasn't fine with it. The night, she asked him directly, not aggressively, not with ultimatums, just honestly whether there was any version of this that became something permanent, something real, something that involved a future that included both of them. He had gone very quiet in the way he went quiet when he was deciding what the true answer was rather than the convenient one. He told her he was not capable of being what she needed. He said it without apology and without elaboration, and she had looked at him across that restaurant table and understood, in the cold, clear way, she understood things she didn't want to be true, that he meant it completely. 3 weeks later, Imani discovered she was pregnant. She thought about telling him for 2 weeks. She sat with her phone in her hand, more nights than she could count, his contact information on the screen, and every time she thought about making that call, she heard his voice saying, "I am not capable of being what you need." And she put the phone down. He had been honest with her. She could not argue with honest. She had called Dija instead. Dej had driven to her apartment with food and stayed for 3 days and helped her build a plan, which was what Deja always did, and Imani had built the plan and followed it with the same precision she brought to everything else. And 11 months later, she was a federal prosecutor with a 4-year-old daughter who had her father's exact eyes and her mother's absolute stubbornness. Imani Caldwell was the best thing in Imani's life. That was not a complicated statement. It was not nostalgic or heavily weighted. It was just true. She had made the right decision. She still believed that. She just hadn't anticipated the particular situation she was currently sitting in. The lunch recess gave Imani 40 minutes. She used 37 of them in the women's restroom on the second floor. Sitting on the bench near the sink, with her lunch untouched in her bag and her phone in her hand, and the kind of headache behind her left eye that meant she hadn't drunk enough water since 6 a. She needed to think clearly. That was the priority. The facts were uncomplicated in legal terms. She had been assigned to this prosecution before the defendant's identity had been specified to her in any way that would have created a conflict of interest. The documentation she had built her case around was solid. She had no personal financial relationship with the defendant. She had no ongoing personal relationship with the defendant. Their previous connection had ended 5 years ago and did not constitute a legal conflict under the guidelines she was bound by. She could request reassignment. That option was available to her. She sat with that option for approximately 4 minutes. Then she thought about the 47 families in the Pacific Northwest whose retirement savings had been drained through fraudulent investment vehicles that ran through Do-hwan's financial network. She thought about the woman who had testified in the grand jury proceedings, 63 years old, worked for 31 years, watched $214,000 disappear in 8 months. She had not cried during the testimony. She had been past crying. She had just been tired in the way people got tired when something had been taken from that couldn't be returned. Imani put her phone back in her bag. She ate half her lunch. She went back downstairs. Do-hwan watched her return to the courtroom. He had spent the lunch recess in a private conference room with his legal team reviewing the morning's opening arguments, and somewhere in the third review of exhibit sequencing, his attorney was saying, and start processing what his lead, attorney the fact that the federal prosecutor assigned to dismantle 20 years of his professional life was a woman. He had spent the last 5 years making himself stop thinking about. He was not prone to rattling. He had built an organization that operated across 12 countries at its peak, and he had sat across tables from people who wanted to kill him and remained in complete control of his expression throughout. The capacity for external calm was not performance. It was the result of understanding, very early in his life, that visible emotion was a resource your opponents could use against you. He was rattled. His attorney had asked him twice if he was following the conversation. He had said yes both times. He had not been following the conversation. When the afternoon session began and Imani stood to continue outlining the prosecution's approach to the financial evidence, Do-hwan watched her with the attention he usually reserved for situations when understanding another person's exact state of mind was the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one. She was composed, completely composed. Her voice was even, her body language was closed and professional, and if you were looking for evidence of disturbance, you would not find it in her presentation. But he had known her when she was not performing composure. He knew the particular quality of stillness she produced when she was managing something difficult. He could see the effort beneath the surface. She knew he was watching her. She was refusing to let it register. He almost respected it. Then he caught himself and returned his attention to the documents in front of him, because the appropriate response to being on trial was not sitting here cataloging Imani Caldwell's emotional condition. He had a more immediate problem. Somewhere in the prosecution's financial documentation, the documentation she had clearly spent an enormous amount of time and skill assembling, were records that would eventually lead to a set of transactions he had not authorized and did not fully understand. Transactions that ran through his organization, but originated with partners who operated at a level that made Do-hwan's operation look like an accounting firm. He had known about those partners for 2 years. He had made choices he was not proud of in how he had handled that knowledge. His attorneys did not know the full extent of what those records contained. He had not told them yet. He was still deciding what telling them would cost him. 3 weeks into the trial, on a Thursday evening, when Seattle was doing what Seattle did in November, and making it clear it could produce rain in approximately 14 different variations. Imani was sitting at her kitchen table at 10:45, with Zuri asleep down the hall and financial records spread across every available surface, and a second cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop. She had found something. It was not the kind of something that simplified her case. It was the kind of something that made her case significantly more complicated in a way that would require her to make decisions she did not want to make. Within Do-hwan's financial network, there was a layer of transactions she had initially categorized as subsidiary fund movements. Standard laundering architecture, not elegant, but effective enough to require 3 months of forensic accounting to untangle. That year, she now understood, contained a set of transfers that had originated outside Do-hwan's standard operational structure. Different timing patterns, different transfer mechanisms, different offshore architecture. She had been so focused on the prosecution against Do-hwan that she had categorized those transfers as part of his network, without sufficiently examining whether they had actually been initiated by his network. She was examining them now. She pulled up a second laptop and opened the subsidiary records and began cross-referencing the transfer authorizations against the organizational chart her forensic accountants had constructed. 2 hours later, she sat back in her chair. There was a second actor. Possibly more than one, operating inside Do-hwan's financial structure in a way that suggested either his knowledge and complicity or his infrastructure being used without full authorization. Both possibilities were deeply problematic. The first made him more culpable than she had charged. The second made the trial significantly more complicated because it meant there were parties connected to this case who had not been indicted and who had reasons serious, potentially violent reasons, to ensure that Imani's prosecution did not reach a conclusion. She rubbed her face with both hands. Down the hall, Zuri's small voice called from behind her bedroom door, "Mommy, I had a bad dream." Imani was out of her chair before the sentence finished. She picked Zuri up and held her, and felt her daughter's arms wrap around her neck with the particular grip that 4-year-olds produced when they needed you to be completely solid. And she sat on the edge of Zuri's bed and rubbed her back and said, "It's okay. I've got you. It was just a dream. Nothing can get to you here." Zuri's dark eyes looked at her in the half-light, the same eyes as her father. "You're still up," Zuri said, not accusing, just observing. "I'm working, baby. You're always working." "I know." Imani pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head. "Go back to sleep." Zuri did eventually, with the easy trust that only very young children managed. Imani sat beside her on the narrow bed until her breathing went deep and even. Then she went back to the kitchen and the financial records, and the problem she didn't yet know how to solve. The call came at 11:52. She almost didn't answer it. Unknown number. She got enough spam that her instinct was to let it go to voicemail and check later. She answered it. The voice was male, distorted just enough to remove any identifying quality without making it obvious that distortion was being used. Like the person on the other end, understood she was a federal prosecutor and had adjusted accordingly. "Ms. Caldwell," the voice said, "you've been very thorough." She was already on her feet, moving toward the window, then stopping herself because movement was an automatic response, and she needed to think clearly. Who is this? Not a question, a statement. She wanted the tone. Someone who has been watching your progress with considerable interest. You've built an impressive case, but you're about to exceed the boundaries of what we're comfortable allowing to reach a jury. Her hand tightened on the phone. "Whatever you believe you're going to accomplish with this call," she said, "I would encourage you to understand who you're calling." "We know exactly who we're calling." A brief pause. "The question is whether you understand the stakes." The line clicked. Then a different sound. Ambient indoor, a room with no particular acoustic quality, nothing she could identify. And then Zuri's voice, small and confused and scared in a way Imani had never heard before. "Mommy?" The floor dropped out of the world. Imani was running down the hall before she processed the decision to move. She hit Zuri's door and pushed it open, and the bed was empty. The window was latched from outside. The room was cold. Her daughter was gone. She stood in the empty doorway, with the phone still pressed to her ear, and the distorted voice came back. Withdraw from the prosecution by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Notify the court of a conflict of interest. Walk away from this case. If you do that, your daughter comes home. Another pause. If you don't, she doesn't. The call ended. Imani stood in her daughter's empty bedroom in the silence and looked at the small pillow that still held the impression of Zuri's head, and for approximately 10 seconds she experienced something she had not allowed herself in years. Complete unmanageable terror. Then she picked up her personal phone, found the contact she had sworn to herself she would never use outside a professional context, and dialed. He answered on the second ring. Imani. He said her name the same way he always had. Like it was specific information. They took her, she said. A beat. Where are you, my apartment? Don't call anyone else. His voice had shifted into something flat and operational. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. She ended the call, stood in her daughter's empty bedroom, and waited for the father, who didn't know he was a father, to come help her bring their little girl home. He arrived in 38 minutes. Imani knew, because she had been watching the clock on the microwave the entire time, standing in her kitchen with her arms crossed over her chest and her phone on the counter in front of her, and the kind of stillness that was not calm but was the closest thing to it she could manage, while every instinct she had was screaming at her. To be doing something, anything, instead of standing here waiting. The knock on her door was 3 times, quiet and even. Not urgent, controlled. She opened it. Do-hwan stood in her hallway in a dark coat that still had rain on the shoulders, and he looked at her the way he had always looked at her when something was wrong, like he was cataloging every detail of her condition before he spoke. Because, speaking before he understood, the situation was a form of carelessness he did not allow himself. Tell me everything, he said, exactly as it happened. She let him in. She did not offer him anything. She did not apologize for the state of the apartment, which had financial records covering most of the kitchen table, and a child's drawing half on the living room floor, and a cold coffee next to the couch that had been there since 9 p.m. She didn't explain or contextualize any of it. She stood in the center of the kitchen and told him, in the order it happened, exactly what she had heard on the phone. He listened without interrupting. He stood near the counter with his coat still on, and his hands at his sides, and his attention completely fixed on her. And she recognized that quality of listening. She had always recognized it and hated herself a little for finding it steadying under the circumstances. When she finished, he was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. The voice, he said, distorted, you said. Yes. Amateur distortion or professional? She thought about it. Not amateur, but not the kind of equipment that costs real money either. Middle ground, he nodded once. The ambient sound behind Zuri's voice. What did you hear? A room, interior. Nothing specific, no traffic, no industrial sound, no music. Climate controlled, maybe. The acoustics were flat. How long was she on the line? 4 seconds, maybe 5. Her voice. How did she sound? Imani's jaw tightened. Scared, confused, not injured. Something moved across Do-hwan's expression at that. Not relief, it was too controlled for relief. But something in his shoulders released by about 3%. This was not authorized by my organization, he said. She looked at him. You understand that's exactly what you would say regardless. Yes. He didn't flinch. I understand that. I'm telling you anyway. Then tell me who did authorize it. He was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. I have suspicions, he said. I need to make some calls to confirm them. There are people connected to financial operations within my network who don't answer to me in the way my direct organization does. They have their own interests. And your prosecution has gotten close enough to certain records that those interests are now threatened. How close? He looked at her steadily. Close enough that they would take a child. The words sat in the kitchen between them like something physical. Imani uncrossed her arms. She pulled out a chair from the kitchen table, moving the financial records aside without looking at them, and sat down. Not because she was tired, because she needed to be lower, more grounded. Because if she kept standing, she was going to start moving, and she couldn't afford to waste energy on movement that didn't accomplish anything. I need to call this in, she said. The FBI has a child abduction protocol. Every minute I don't make that call. If you make that call tonight, Do-hwan said, the people who have her will know within the hour. They have sources, not inside the FBI, inside the communication infrastructure around it. A child abduction report connected to an active federal trial will generate a specific kind of activity that these people are watching for. You're asking me to not report my daughter's kidnapping. I'm telling you what the risk calculation looks like. His voice was even. Not cold, just precise. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm giving you information. What you do with it is your decision. Imani looked at him for a long moment. You have 48 hours, she said. If Zuri is not home in 48 hours, I make every call available to me and I stop caring what it costs. Are we clear? We're clear. Then start making your calls. He pulled out his phone and walked toward the living room, and Imani watched him go. And then she looked down at the half-finished drawing on the floor, a house with a lopsided tree and a figure with a yellow dress that was supposed to be Imani, and she pressed her hand flat against the table and breathed. She was not going to fall apart. Not yet. Maybe not at all. Do-hwan made 4 calls in the next 90 minutes, standing near the window in Imani's living room, speaking in Korean at a volume, low enough that she could hear the rhythm but not the words. She didn't try to listen. She used the time to pull up her case files on her laptop and begin cross-referencing the subsidiary transaction records she'd been working on earlier, because sitting still was not something she was capable of, and productive work was the only alternative to panic that she trusted. The 4th call lasted 22 minutes. When Do-hwan came back into the kitchen, his expression had shifted. Not dramatically, but she had spent 4 months learning the minor adjustments of that face, and she could read it well enough to know that the 4th call had confirmed something he'd hoped was wrong. Tell me, she said. He sat down across from her. First time he'd sat since he arrived. That was significant. It meant the immediate operational urgency had shifted from action to analysis. There is a man, he said. His name is Park Sung-jin. He has never been a formal member of my organization. He is a financial partner. His money moved through some of my subsidiary structures over the past 6 years, through a series of agreements I entered into that I would make differently if I were making them today. What kind of money? The kind that doesn't have clean origins. He said it without embellishment. I understood that when I agreed to the arrangement, Hassan. I made a calculation about the benefit against the exposure, and I was wrong about the exposure. That is the honest version. And Park Sung-jin is the person who authorized taking Zuri. I believe so. He has an operation in the greater Seattle area, legitimate surface businesses, freight forwarding, commercial real estate. Underneath that, moving people and product through the port infrastructure. My network has been useful to him as a financial layer. Your prosecution threatens to expose the financial layer. If those records become part of a public trial, his name will eventually surface. Imani's hands had gone very still on the keyboard. Where is she? I don't know yet. I have people working on it. People. Yes. What kind of people? Do-hwan looked at her steadily. The kind who can find things that law enforcement cannot find quickly through methods that law enforcement cannot use. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Imani closed her laptop. She pressed her fingertips together and looked at the table and ran through the logical framework of what he was telling her, because logic was the thing she could actually control right now, and she was going to hold on to it with both hands. If your people find her, she said, and the operation that recovers her is conducted outside of legal authority, the people responsible will still be prosecuted, Do-hwan said. I'm not offering to make this disappear. I'm offering to find your daughter. What happens after that is law enforcement's problem to handle correctly. My problem, she said. I am law enforcement. Then you'll handle it correctly. She looked up at him. There was something in his face she couldn't categorize. It wasn't quite guilt, it was more complex than guilt. More like a man who had spent years making a particular kind of calculation and had arrived at a moment where the cost of those calculations had shown up at a table he hadn't expected it to reach. Why did you answer the phone? She said. What? It was almost midnight. Unknown caller. You answered in 2 rings. She kept her eyes on his. You could have let it go to voicemail. We're not. This is not a relationship where I call you at midnight. Do-hwan's jaw shifted slightly. I don't let calls go to voicemail at midnight. That's an operational habit. Yes. And the 40 minutes. You came in 40 minutes. From where? A pause. I was at my residence. Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill is 15 minutes from here in no traffic. There was traffic. At midnight. He said nothing. Imani looked at him for a long moment. Were you already watching this building? Do-hwan's expression didn't change, but he didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. You have been monitoring this prosecution, she said. Not a question. I'm the defendant. You've been monitoring me specifically. Her voice stayed level. Not just the legal proceedings. Me, my location. I needed to understand the risk profile of don't. She cut him off cleanly. Don't give me the operational framing. Answer the question directly, or don't answer it. The muscle in his jaw moved. Yes, I have had some awareness of your movements. For safety reasons that I can now see, you're going to frame as something sinister. I'm going to frame it, she said carefully. As a federal prosecutor who is also the opposing counsel in your trial, discovering that the defendant has been monitoring her location, which is obstruction and intimidation, and approximately 4 other things I could charge you with before breakfast. You could, and you did it anyway. I did it because… He stopped. Started again with different words. I knew who you were the moment the trial was assigned. Before the first hearing, I needed to understand whether the prosecution was personal. Something cold moved through her. You thought I built this case against you deliberately. I considered it as a possibility. I didn't know it was you until I walked into that courtroom. I know that now. How do you know it? Because the case you built is too good, he said. If you had known it was me, there would have been gaps. Places where you pulled back without meaning to. There are no gaps. The prosecution it's thorough in a way that can only come from not caring who the target is. Imani looked at the table. She looked at her laptop. She looked at the drawing on the living room floor. Get out of my kitchen, she said. Do-hwan got up without argument. I'll be in the living room, he said. I need to stay close tonight in case information comes in that requires immediate decisions. She didn't tell him he could or couldn't. She reopened her laptop and went back to the financial records and didn't look at him again. The information came at 3:47 in the morning. Do-hwan came to the kitchen doorway. He looked worse than he had 3 hours ago, not visibly. But there was a specific kind of exhaustion in the way he held himself that she associated with people who had been managing high-stress situations for hours without releasing any of the tension. We have a location, he said, south of the city, industrial property, a freight company that runs legitimate operations on the surface. Imani was already standing. Park Sung-jin's operation. Connected to it, a subsidiary 2 layers removed. My people confirmed vehicle movements in the last 4 hours that are consistent with a small containment operation. How many people? Estimated 4 to 6 on site. Armed. Almost certainly. She was already picking up her phone. She looked at him. I'm calling federal support. You can tell me again about communication risks, and I will remind you that this is now a confirmed location, not a tip, and I am not sending law enforcement in blind. Do-hwan said nothing. She called her federal investigator contact, Daniel Reyes, 12 years FBI, the one person in the bureau she trusted completely on situations that required both speed and discretion. She gave him the location and told him she had credible intelligence of a confirmed kidnapping victim, and she needed a team that could move without broadcasting through standard channels for the first 30 minutes. Reyes said he could have people there in 50 minutes. 40. Imani said. 39 minutes later, she stood outside, a building that smelled like diesel and cold concrete, and watched the lights go on inside as the team moved in. She was not supposed to be there. She was supposed to be in a parking lot 2 blocks away. She had been in the parking lot for approximately 4 minutes before she had decided she was not capable of waiting in a parking lot and had walked toward the building, and Reyes had seen her coming and said Imani, and she had looked at him with an expression that apparently communicated the futility of the conversation, because he had sighed and said, "Stay behind me," and she had. Zuri was in a back room behind a locked door. She was sitting on a folding cot with a blanket around her shoulders and a juice box on the floor next to her that someone had apparently given her. Seen a sound, the door opened and the light changed. She looked up with the expression of a child who had been very frightened for many hours and had used up most of the visible fear and arrived at the exhausted territory on the other side of it. She saw Imani. She stood up so fast she knocked the juice box over. Mommy Imani was across the room. She pulled Zuri into her arms and held her so tight that Zuri made a small indignant sound, and Imani loosened her grip by about 10%, and Zuri gripped her back just as hard and put her face against Imani's neck, and they stayed like that. Imani's eyes were closed. She didn't allow herself longer than 90 seconds. Then she leaned back and looked at Zuri's face, checking with the quick, methodical attention of someone who needed facts. "Are you hurt? Did anyone hurt you?" "No." Zuri's voice was stuffy. "They were mean, but they didn't hurt me." "Mean how?" "They were loud and they wouldn't let me call you, and they said I had to stay in the room." Zuri's chin doing the thing it did before she cried. "I was really scared, Mommy. I know. I know you were." Imani pressed her forehead against Zuri's. "I came as fast as I could. I'm here now. Can we go home?" "Yes. Right now. We're going home." She carried Zuri out of the building. Outside in the narrow space between the building and the chain-link fence, a black sedan was parked with its lights off. She didn't look at it directly, but in her peripheral vision she could see the outline of someone standing in the shadow beside it, hands in coat pockets, not moving toward her, just watching. She knew who it was. She kept walking. She had Zuri. Everything else could wait until her daughter was home and safe and asleep in her own bed. Imani didn't sleep. She sat in the chair next to Zuri's bed until the sky outside the window went from black to gray, and when Zuri's breathing was completely even, and had been for 2 hours, she went back to the kitchen and sat down in front of her laptop and stared at the financial records and thought about everything she now knew. Park Sung-jin, a name she hadn't encountered in 340 pages of initial documentation. A man who had moved serious money through Do-hwan's financial infrastructure and was now apparently willing to kidnap a 4-year-old child to prevent a federal prosecution from exposing the connection. Do-hwan had given her the name. That was the thing she kept returning to. He had come to her apartment at midnight, given her operational intelligence that had led directly to Zuri's recovery, and in the process had effectively handed her a thread that, if she pulled it, would likely complicate his own defense in ways that hadn't fully developed yet. She needed to understand why he had done that. The professional answer was that providing the intelligence had bought him goodwill and complicated the prosecution's case by introducing a second actor. That was the cynical red, and it wasn't wrong. But there was another red. And she sat with it for a long time because it was less comfortable than the cynical version. He had come because she called. He had come fast, and he had used every resource available to him, and he had not once, not in the entire night, attempted to use the situation to negotiate anything regarding the trial. He had not offered her a deal. He had not threatened her. He had not made any move that a man protecting his own interests would have made. He had just found Zuri. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. She thought about the way his expression had changed when she confirmed Zuri had not been hurt. That 3% release in his shoulders. The thing that was not quite relief but functioned like it. He didn't know, she reminded herself. He couldn't know. There was no version of events in which Seo Do-hwan understood that the 4-year-old who had been taken from Imani Caldwell's apartment was the daughter he didn't know he had. Which meant whatever he had done tonight, he had done without that information. She didn't know what to do with that. She closed the laptop and looked at the half-finished drawings still on the living room floor. The house with the lopsided tree, the figure in the yellow dress. She had 48 hours before she had to be back in that courtroom. She had a prosecution to continue, a second criminal actor to investigate, and a defendant who had just demonstrated that he was willing to put his own freedom at risk to help her, without knowing the full weight of what was at stake. And underneath all of it, a secret that was getting harder and harder to justify keeping. She got up and picked the drawing off the floor and set it on the table carefully, smoothing the corners. Then she opened a new document on her laptop and started writing down everything she knew about Park Sung-jin. She wasn't withdrawing from this prosecution. She wasn't stepping back, stepping aside, or giving anyone the quiet exit they were hoping for. But she was going to need to be very careful about what happened next, because the situation she was operating inside had just become several degrees more dangerous than it had 24 hours ago. And the man sitting at the defense table across from her, in courtroom 7, was no longer simply the subject of her case. He was, whether she was ready to accept it or not, the one person who had just proven he would show up when it mattered. She did not know what to do with a man like that. She was going to have to figure it out anyway. She filed the amended investigation request at 6:41 in the morning. Not because she was ready, because waiting until she was ready was a luxury that had expired sometime around midnight when her daughter's voice came through a stranger's phone. The request went to Daniel Reyes directly, bypassing the standard routing that would have put it through 3 supervisory layers before anyone with actual authority saw it. She cited exigent circumstances, active threat to a federal prosecution, and credible intelligence regarding a secondary criminal actor with connections to the primary case. She attached everything she had built on Park Sung in the 3 hours between Zuri falling asleep and the sky going gray. It wasn't enough to charge anyone yet. It was enough to start pulling the thread. Reyes called her at 7:15. "You look like you haven't slept," he said, which meant he could hear it in her voice even over the phone. "I haven't. Did you read it?" "I read it. Imani, this is accurate. Park Sung-jin has been running a secondary operation through Hanul Pacific subsidiary structure for at least 4 years. That's not a footnote to your case. That's a parallel indictment. I know what it is. The question I have to ask. Where the intelligence came from. I know. She had been waiting for this question since 6 a.m. I received it from a confidential source with direct knowledge of Hanul Pacific's internal financial structure. A silence that lasted slightly too long. A confidential source. Yes. Imani. Daniel. Another silence. She could hear him thinking through the implications, sorting them into categories, understanding without her having to say it explicitly what category the source was likely in. The source's information led directly to the recovery of an abducted minor, she said. The information was accurate, timely, and produced 0 collateral complications. That's the record, and the source's motivations are being evaluated. She looked at the kitchen table. Are you going to work the Park Sung-jin angle or not? I'm going to work it, Reyes said. I'm going to work it carefully, and I'm going to pretend for now that I don't have significant questions about the chain of custody on this intelligence. But Imani, we're going to have that conversation eventually. Eventually, she agreed. Not today. She ended the call and went to check on Zuri. Zuri was awake, sitting up in her bed with a stuffed elephant in her lap, looking at the door, when Imani pushed it open in a way that suggested she had been listening for footsteps. Are you hungry? Imani said. Yes, a pause. Mommy, who were those men? Imani came in and sat on the edge of the bed. She had thought about this on the walk down the hall. She had about 45 seconds of thinking prepared. Some people who were trying to make me stop doing my job, she said. They made a bad decision, and now they're in a lot of trouble. Zuri considered this. Because of you. Because of what they did. Are they going to do it again? No. Imani said it with the absolute certainty she had decided on before she opened the door, because Zuri was 4 years old and needed certainty more than nuance right now. They're not going to do it again. Zuri looked at her with her father's eyes, which was a thing Imani had learned to absorb without showing it on her face years ago. Okay, Zuri said. Can I have the cereal with the stars? You can have whatever you want today. Can I stay home from school? Yes. Zuri's expression shifted into something that was attempting not to look too pleased about this under the circumstances. Can Dija come? I'll call her after breakfast. She made cereal with stars and sat across the table from her daughter and watched Zuri eat with the focused efficiency of a child who had decided the crisis was over and had moved on to the next priority, which was breakfast. Imani drank coffee that was too hot and didn't taste it. She had a 9 a.m. court appearance in 4 hours. She was going to make it. She left Zuri with Dija, who arrived in 20 minutes with an overnight bag and an expression that communicated she had approximately 900 questions and the good judgment to hold all of them until Imani was in a position to answer them. "She's okay," Imani said at the door. "She looks okay." Deja looked at Imani. "You don't. I'll deal with it later. You always deal with it later." "That's worked out fine so far." Imani picked up her briefcase. "Don't let her have more than one episode of the cartoon with the talking dogs." "She'll tell you I said two." "Imani, I have to go." Deja caught her arm, not hard, just enough to make her stop. "Whatever is happening, and I know something is happening, you don't have to handle all of it alone." Imani looked at her. "I know," she didn't say anything else. She squeezed Deja's hand once and walked to the elevator and didn't look back. Because if she looked back, she was going to see Zuri standing in the doorway and she was not going to be able to leave. Courtroom 7 looked exactly the same, as it had looked every morning for the past 3 weeks. That struck her as wrong somehow. The lighting was the same flat institutional fluorescent. The gallery was arranged in the same configuration of local press, legal observers, and members of the public who had gotten there early enough to claim seats. Judge Wynn's bench sat empty with the same authoritative stillness. Imani set her briefcase on the prosecution table and opened it and began removing her exhibit packets in order. She did not look at the defense table. She decided this on the drive over. Looking at Do-hwan, in this context after last night, was a variable she could not control, and she was running low enough on controllable variables that she needed to be deliberate about protecting the ones she had left. She heard the defense team arrive. She heard chairs moving, the particular acoustic shuffle of lawyers organizing papers and laptops. She kept her attention on her own materials. Then Do-hwan spoke. Not to her, to one of his attorneys. A brief, quiet instruction in English about the sequencing of a document the defense planned to introduce. His voice was exactly the same as it had been at 3 in the morning in her living room. Controlled, specific, quiet in a way that required attention from the people around him rather than volume. She pressed her pen flat against the exhibit packet and breathed. Judge Wynn entered at 9:03. The morning session proceeded. Imani presented financial expert testimony establishing the mechanism by which investor funds had moved through Hanel Pacific's subsidiary structure into offshore accounts. The expert was thorough, credible, and translated complex transfer architecture into language that the jury could follow. Imani had prepared him for 6 weeks, and it showed. She did not miss a single question. She did not look at Do-hwan once. He watched her the entire morning. She could feel it the same way. She had felt it on the first day, that quality of fixed attention that he produced without apparent effort. It was not threatening. It wasn't intended to rattle her. She understood that. She understood it in a way that was almost more difficult to manage than if it had been threatening. At the lunch recess, she went directly to the conference room she had reserved and spread her notes across the table and ate a sandwich without tasting it and reviewed the afternoon's exhibit sequence. Her phone rang at 12:41. "Reyes, we have a problem," he said, and something in the flatness of his voice made her set the sandwich down. "Talk to me." "The amended investigation request. I routed it this morning through the secure channel we discussed, keeping it contained to our team and 2 supervisory sign-offs. Standard restricted protocol for sensitive prosecution adjacent intelligence." And at 11:22 this morning, Park Sung-jin's primary corporate attorney filed an emergency motion with a different federal judge, Judge Harold Keene, not Wynn, alleging that the investigation request constitutes prosecutorial misconduct in connection with the Hanel Pacific trial. He has a copy of the request, Imani. The full document, including the attached intelligence summary. She was very still. "That's not possible," she said. "I know it's not possible. I ran the access log myself. 4 people touched that document before 11 Me, you, supervisory agent Christine Holt, and a case coordinator named James Whitmer who has been on my team for 8 months. Which one? I don't know yet. I'm pulling records right now. But whoever it is moved fast. Park Sung-jin's attorney had that document within 4 hours of us generating it." Imani stood up from the table. She needed to stand up. She needed to move. "The motion," she said. "What specifically is it alleging?" that you generated false intelligence in connection with the defendant in your active prosecution, meaning Do-hwan, and used that false intelligence to conduct an unauthorized investigation of a third party as a means of creating a distraction from weaknesses in your primary case. She laughed. It came out wrong, too sharp, too short. They're claiming Do-hwan gave me fabricated intelligence. That's what they're claiming, which would mean the kidnapping was either fabricated or staged as a setup too. She stopped. This is a discrediting operation. They're not trying to stop the investigation. They're trying to destroy the credibility of everything that came from last night, including the recovery of your daughter, Reyes said carefully. They're not disputing that she was taken. They're alleging that the operation that recovered her was unauthorized, conducted with intelligence from a compromised source, and constitutes an illegal coordination between a federal prosecutor and the defendant in her own case. The room was very quiet. If that motion gains traction, she said, your prosecution of Do-hwan is finished. Any evidence of coordination between you and the defendant is grounds for mistrial. And if the mistrial is granted under circumstances suggesting misconduct, the case may not be re-prosecutable. And Park Sung-jin walks. Park Sung-jin walks, Do-hwan potentially walks, and you face a disciplinary review that could end your career. A pause. I'm sorry, Imani. I don't know yet who leaked it, but whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. She pressed her hand flat against the conference table, the same gesture she had used in her kitchen at 6 a.m., and she noted the repetition with some detached part of her brain that was still cataloging things even now. Find Whitmer, she said. If it was him, I need to know in the next 2 hours. And pull Christine Holt's access records too. I'm not ruling anyone out. Already running it. And Daniel. She made herself say the next part clearly. Whatever you find, I need it to be clean. Evidence only. Nothing that can be challenged. I know how to do my job. I know you do. Find it fast. She ended the call and stood in the conference room alone and looked at the sandwich she wasn't going to finish and thought, with extraordinary clarity, about how precisely and completely the situation had turned. She had spent 11 months building a prosecution that was solid. She had pushed through a kidnapping. She had recovered her daughter. She had come back to court this morning and executed a flawless morning session. She had done everything correctly, and someone inside Reyes's team had handed her entire position to the opposition inside 4 hours. The afternoon session was the longest 2 hours of Imani's professional life. She stood at the prosecution table and presented testimony and cross-examined the defense's financial counter-expert with the kind of precision that came not from calm, but from having no other option available. Falling apart was not available. Showing disturbance was not available. Requesting a recess to manage a personal crisis was not available. So she performed the function she was there to perform, and she did it well enough that when Judge Wynn gavelled the session, closed at 4:15, a sound like green wood splitting, the court reporter looked up from her machine with an expression that suggested the afternoon had been worth attending. Imani gathered her materials. She did not move fast enough. Ms. Caldwell, Do-hwan's voice. Behind her, close enough to be private, far enough to be technically appropriate in a public space. She turned. His attorneys were still packing up at the defense table. The gallery was clearing. There were people around, but the immediate conversational space was theirs for approximately 60 seconds before someone moved into it. I need you to hear something, he said. Anything relevant to the case goes through. This is not about the case. His voice was very low. There is a motion being filed against you today. You may already know about it. She looked at him. I found out an hour ago, he said. Someone inside Park Sung-jin's legal operation is moving to have you removed from this prosecution on misconduct grounds. They're going to use last night what I did, what you did as the mechanism. They want this trial destroyed. I'm aware, she said. Something moved across his face. How long have you known? Since noon. You came back in here this afternoon knowing… Yes, he was quiet for a moment. The intelligence I gave you last night. The source I used to locate the property. If that becomes part of a misconduct hearing, I am the evidence against you. They will use my cooperation as proof that you were in an unauthorized relationship with the defendant. I understand the legal architecture, Mr. Seo. I can provide a statement, he said, voluntarily, to Reyes, or to whatever oversight body reviews the motion. I can state clearly and on the record that the intelligence I provided last night was provided in response to a crisis involving a civilian minor with no connection to the legal proceedings. That you did not solicit my cooperation regarding the case. That our communication was limited entirely to the recovery operation. She stared at him. You understand that a voluntary statement from the defendant in your own trial in defense of the prosecutor will not reduce suspicion of coordination, it will confirm it. I understand that, then why? Because the alternative is allowing you to take the consequence of something I did, he said. And I'm not willing to do that. The 60 seconds were almost up. She could see his lead attorney moving toward them from the defense table. Don't file anything, she said. Don't make any statements to anyone without my knowledge. If you move independently on this, you will make it worse. Do you understand me? I understand you. Then stand down. She picked up her briefcase. I'll handle it. She walked out of the courtroom. She made it to the elevator before her hands started shaking. James Whitmer was 29 years old, had a business administration degree from the University of Oregon, and had been hired into Reyes's team through a staffing transition that, as Reyes discussed at 3:47 that afternoon, had been partially facilitated by a recommendation letter from a mid-level administrator at a Seattle commercial freight association that had, it turned out, significant professional connections to Park Sung-jin's legitimate business network. Imani read the summary. Ray sent her in the parking garage below the federal building, sitting in her car with the engine running, and the particular cold that spread through her was not anger. Anger was too simple. This was more like standing in a room where you understood, only now, exactly how many walls had already been moved without your knowledge. Whitmer had resigned that morning. His personal phone showed a series of calls to a number, registered to a shell company that Imani recognized from her own financial investigation files. He had been placed inside the investigation team 8 months ago, when the Hanul Pacific prosecution was already in its early stages, and he had waited with the patience of someone who understood that the valuable intelligence wasn't available immediately. It was available at the exact moment it could cause the most damage. 8 months. He had sat inside Reyes's operation for 8 months. She called Reyes. Where is he gone? He had a 3-hour head start on us. We have a bolo out, but he won't be in the country by tonight. Probably not, no. She looked at the concrete pillar in front of her car. The motion. Judge Keene. Hearing is scheduled for day after tomorrow. Park Sung-jin's attorneys are moving fast. Who is representing his interests in the motion? Not his corporate attorney who is handling the misconduct claim specifically. A pause as Reyes checked. A firm called Garland Morse Associates. They specialize in federal litigation defense. She knew the name. Good firm. Expensive firm. The kind of firm that didn't take cases unless the client had both the money and the documentation to make the argument credible. They have the document, she said. They have the intelligence summary. What else does Whitmer have access to that he could have copied? Reyes was quiet for a moment that was slightly too long. He had read access to the full case file, he said. All of it. 11 months of prosecution materials. The parking garage was very quiet. A car moved somewhere on an upper level, the sound of tires on concrete echoing down. He has everything, she said. He has everything. She sat with that for 10 seconds. 15. Counting the weight of it. Then we have to assume, she said, that Park Sung-jin knows the full structure of our case against Do-hwan. Every witness, every financial exhibit, every angle of approach we plan to use in the remaining trial weeks. He has it all. Yes, and he's sharing it, either with Do-hwan's defense team or against it, depending on which outcome serves his interests better. Reyes's voice was careful. If Do-hwan's conviction exposes Park's connections, Park wants the trial destroyed. If Do-hwan's acquittal provides cover for Park's operation, he might feed the defense material that helps them. Either way, Imani said, my prosecution as it currently exists is compromised. The evidentiary structure is still valid. The documents can't be contaminated by Daniel. She stopped him. Think about what you're saying. If the defense has advanced knowledge of every exhibit I plan to introduce, every witness I plan to call, every angle I plan to use, for cross-examination they have months to build counter-arguments I haven't anticipated. The documents are valid. The strategy is burned. Silence. I have to rebuild, she said. I have to rebuild the approach from scratch. Different sequencing, different witness order, different exhibit framing. Everything they know is now a liability, and I have to work around every single piece of it without letting the defense know that I know they have it. How long do you need? She thought about it with the cold calculation that had taken over the part of her brain where panic would have been, if she had allowed panic. I needed 2 weeks ago, she said. I have 2 days before a misconduct hearing that might pull me off this case entirely. She started the car. Get me everything you have on Whitmer's access logs. Every document he touched, every date, every timestamp. I need to know exactly what they know. You'll have it in an hour. 30 minutes. She pulled out of the parking space and drove toward the exit and thought about what she was going to tell Deja when she got home, which was nothing. She was going to say nothing, because Deja would tell her she needed to stop, and she didn't have the option of stopping. She thought about Zuri eating cereal with stars and declaring the crisis over. She thought about Do-hwan standing in the courtroom saying, I am not willing to let you take the consequence of something I did. She thought about 11 months of work, sitting in a corrupted file on a laptop that had belonged to a man who had been waiting in position for the exact right moment. She merged onto the highway and pressed her foot down and drove. The call came at 8:07 that evening. She was sitting on the floor of her home office with Whitmer's access logs spread across the carpet around her, cross-referencing timestamps against her case file index, when her personal phone lit up with a number she recognized as one of Do-hwan's attorneys. Not Do-hwan himself, his attorney. She answered it, because not answering it was the kind of decision she couldn't afford to make on instinct anymore. Ms. Caldwell. The attorney's name was Bennett. She had dealt with him across the table for 3 weeks and found him competent and precise and almost aggressively careful. I'm calling on behalf of my client with information that he believes is relevant to your situation. He asked me to convey that he understands if you decline to hear it. What information? He has knowledge of the specific documents James Whitmer transmitted to Park Sung-jin's legal team. Not partial knowledge, comprehensive knowledge. He knows this because Park Sung-jin's operation and his own organization have had overlapping communication infrastructure for several years, and through that infrastructure, he has access to certain internal communications. She was very still on the floor among the scattered papers. He's been monitoring Park Sung-jin's communications, she said. He has had visibility into certain communications, yes. He wants you to know that the transmitted materials include not only your case strategy documents, but also a set of financial records that Whitmer generated and inserted into the transmission records that do not exist in your actual case file but will be presented as if they do. Fabricated evidence designed to support the misconduct motion. Documents that purport to show a coordinated strategy discussion between you and my client prior to last night's events. The floor felt like it had moved slightly beneath her. They're going to present manufactured evidence, she said. At the Keene hearing in 48 hours, yes. My client wanted you to have sufficient time to identify and counter the fabrications before they're introduced. She looked at the logs spread around her. She looked at the case file index. She thought about 47 families in the Pacific Northwest and a 63-year-old woman who had gone past crying and arrived at tired. Your client understands, she said carefully, that the source of this information, his access to Park Sung-jin's internal communications, constitutes significant legal exposure for him in addition to everything else he's already facing. He understands that. He's handing me the tool to dismantle the misconduct motion and continue a prosecution that ends with his conviction. Yes, Miss Caldwell, he is. She sat on the floor of her home office with 11 months of work around her in paper and the sound of Zuri's cartoon coming through the wall from the living room, and she understood, with the precision that had always been her greatest professional asset, that Seo Do-hwan had just made a choice that had no version of self-interest built into it. Tell your client, she said, that I'll need the full communication record. Every document, time-stamped and formatted for federal evidentiary standards. He anticipated that. You'll have it before midnight. She ended the call. She looked at the scattered papers around her. She had 48 hours to rebuild a prosecution, counter fabricated evidence at a misconduct hearing, and figure out what it meant that the man she was trying to convict had just handed her everything she needed to keep convicting him. And underneath all of it, getting louder and more insistent with every hour, was a truth she had kept buried for 4 years that was running out of room to stay buried in. The communication records arrived at 11:47 p. Imani was still on the floor when her laptop chimed. She had moved from the scattered access logs to a yellow legal pad where she had been rebuilding her trial strategy by hand, writing out exhibit sequences and witness approaches in the deliberate analog way she used when she needed to think without the interference of a screen, and when the email notifications appeared. She closed the pad and opened the laptop and read. Do-hwan's attorney had sent 41 documents, time-stamped internal communications from Park Sung-jin's legal and operational network, spanning 14 days. The fabricated evidence was in Document 37, a manufactured transcript of a supposed strategy meeting between Imani and Do-hwan dated 6 weeks before Zuri's kidnapping, detailed enough to be credible on first read and flawed in exactly the ways that only someone with the original case file chronology could identify. She identified 7 internal inconsistencies in 11 minutes. The fabricators had been good. They had used the correct case file terminology, the right exhibit numbers, the appropriate procedural language. But they had made the meeting occur on a date when Do-hwan had been in a different city, a fact documented in his own legal team's travel records, and they had referenced an exhibit that Imani had not numbered. Until 3 weeks after the supposed meeting date. Small errors. The kind that only materialized if you knew what to look for. She knew exactly what to look for. She built the counter-argument in 90 minutes. She formatted it for federal evidentiary presentation, attached the authentication records that Reyes would need to verify the communication logs as genuine, and wrote the cover memorandum with the flat economy of language she used when she was too exhausted for anything except precision. She sent it to Reyes at 1:23 in the morning with a single line of instruction. We need 15 minutes with Judge Keene before the hearing opens. Make it happen. Then she closed her laptop and sat in the silence of her home office and listened to the apartment. Zuri was asleep. Dija had stayed, stretched out on the couch with a blanket Imani had put over her at 11. The building was quiet. Somewhere below, the city was doing what the city did at 1 in the morning, which was exist in a diminished register, fewer voices, fewer engines, the particular urban hush that wasn't silence, but was the closest approximation of it. Imani sat in it and thought about Do-hwan, not about the legal situation, not about the hearing or the trial or the 47 families or the misconduct motion. She thought about the man specifically. She allowed herself to do it without the professional framing she had been using as insulation for 3 weeks, because she was alone and exhausted, and the insulation had worn thin enough that maintaining it was costing more than she could afford. He had given her everything that could keep him in prison. She had understood it intellectually when Bennett called. She understood it now, in a different way we understood when the adrenaline was gone and you were sitting alone at 1 in the morning with the full weight of it available. He had not done it to reduce his sentence. He had not done it as a negotiating position. His attorneys had not arranged it with the prosecution's office as part of some quiet deal she wasn't aware of. She would have known about a deal. He had done it because he had decided to, and the decision had no identifiable version of self-interest attached to it. She did not know what to do with a man who made decisions like that. She had not known for 3 weeks, and she was not going to solve it at 1:20 in the morning. So she got up off the floor and went to bed and stared at the ceiling until sometime around 3 a.m. when her body made the decision for her. The pre-hearing conference with Judge Keene lasted 11 minutes. Imani presented the fabrication evidence with the 7 identified inconsistencies, the authentication records for the communication logs, and a formal counter motion citing manufactured evidence and bad faith filing. Keene was 61 years old and had been on the federal bench for 19 years and had the particular quality of attention that very experienced judges develop the capacity to absorb complex information rapidly and render a preliminary assessment without performing the process of rendering it. He read the documentation. He asked 4 questions. He looked at Park Sung-jin's lead attorney, whose name was Garland himself, Marcus Garland, founding partner, the kind of attorney who appeared personally when the situation was expensive enough, and said 3 words. Where did these originate? Garland said his client had received them through normal discovery channels. Keene looked at him for a moment, the way experienced judges looked at statements they found inadequate. The hearing is suspended pending a review of the evidentiary authentication presented by the prosecution, he said. Mr. Garland, your client's motion is tabled. I'll have a ruling on the authenticity question within 72 hours. If the fabrication allegation is substantiated, we will be having a very different conversation. Garland's face did not change. He was too good for that. But Imani had been watching people manage their expressions under pressure for 11 years, and she could see the specific quality of stillness that appeared in his jaw when he understood a position had shifted badly. She walked out of Keene's courtroom into the hallway and allowed herself exactly 4 seconds of something that was not quite relief. Relief required a problem to be solved. And nothing was solved yet, but was at least the sensation of having stopped a particular form of bleeding. Then she walked to the elevator and went downstairs and crossed the building to courtroom 7 because she had a trial to continue. The morning session of week 4 began with the defense's first major counter-witness. His name was Raymond Cho, and he was a forensic accountant with 23 years of experience credentials that the defense had spent 40 minutes before he said anything substantive. He was calm, precise, and had clearly been prepared extensively for what he was about to do, which was systematically reframe every financial transaction Imani had presented in the previous 3 weeks as the product of standard, if aggressive, offshore tax optimization rather than criminal laundering. He was good. Imani had anticipated he would be good. What she had not anticipated, what she could not have anticipated before Whitmer's betrayal had clarified the full picture of what the defense possessed, was how specifically Cho's testimony tracked the vulnerabilities in her own exhibit structure. He hit the exact seams she would have targeted if she had been building the defense argument herself. The places where the financial trail was most dependent on inference rather than direct documentation. The transfer mechanisms that required the jury to follow 2 additional logical steps to reach the conclusion she was pointing toward. He had seen her entire case. She cross-examined him for 1 hour and 40 minutes. She had rebuilt her approach in the 48 hours since Whitmer's access logs had confirmed the extent of the breach. She did not follow the cross-examination strategy she had prepared over the previous months. She used an approach she had constructed by hand on a legal pad at midnight, built around the 7 elements of her evidence that Whitmer would not have had access to because she had developed them after his last documented file access. Cho was prepared for the case he had read. He was not prepared for the case she had built in the last 48 hours. The first crack appeared 40 minutes into the cross-examination when she introduced a subsidiary authorization record that had not appeared in any of her previous exhibits. Cho looked at the document with the micro-expression of a man who had not seen this particular piece of paper before and was processing very rapidly how it affected the framework he had spent weeks constructing. You testified, Imani, that the transfer from Hanul Pacific's third-tier investment subsidiary to the Cayman account designated 7,741 North represented a standard inter-fund rebalancing mechanism. That's correct. Would it change your analysis if I told you that the authorization signature on that transfer does not match the signatory authority established in Hanul Pacific's own internal corporate governance documents? Cho looked at the document again. I would need to review. The document is in front of you. The signatory authority chart is in your exhibit packet, tab 14. I'll give you a moment. The courtroom was quiet, in the way courtrooms went quiet when something was shifting. Cho found tab 14. He looked at it. He looked at the transfer authorization. Something moved through his expression that he controlled well, but not completely. The signatures appear to be from different individuals, he said carefully. They appear to be, Imani agreed. Specifically, the transfer was authorized by someone who did not have corporate signatory authority for that account at the time the transfer occurred, which means this was not a standard rebalancing mechanism. It was an unauthorized transfer conducted through a structure that had been modified to accommodate it. She paused. How does that affect your testimony regarding the routine nature of this transaction? Cho's answer was careful and partial, and no longer supported his original framing. She spent the next hour doing the same thing to 3 additional elements of his testimony. When Judge Wynn recessed for lunch, the defense's lead attorney, a man named Hartwell, who had been in federal litigation for 30 years and had the composure to match, was bent over the defense table, speaking quietly to Do-hwan with an urgency he was visibly working to contain. Do-hwan was listening. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. His face was arranged in its standard controlled expression. But he was watching Imani pack up her exhibits. She could feel it. She did not look at him. Reyes called during the lunch recess. Keen's office just contacted me. The authentication review is moving faster than expected. He's bringing in an independent forensic document examiner, private contractor, not court staff. Results expected by tomorrow morning. Good. Also, a pause with weight in it. 2 of the men arrested at the warehouse property have decided to cooperate. They're represented by separate counsel, and both counsel have reached out about proffer agreements. Imani set down her fork. What are they offering? Direct testimony connecting the kidnapping operation to Park Sung-jin. Not through corporate structure, not through financial inference direct. One of them was in a room when Park authorized the operation. The lunch she'd been eating stopped mattering. Can we trust it? Both of them are facing serious federal time, and both have family situations that make cooperation rational. A sound like green wood splitting. The accounts are consistent with each other on the key details and consistent with the physical evidence from the warehouse. I think it's real. Get me in a room with their attorneys this afternoon. You're in trial. Get me in a room with them after session. 5 o'clock. I don't care where done. Another pause. Imani. If this holds, if the Keen hearing goes our way, and these proffer agreements produce usable testimony, we're looking at a significant expansion of the indictment. Park Sung-jin as a named defendant. Conspiracy to obstruct a federal prosecution. Kidnapping with federal jurisdiction. The whole structure. I know what we're looking at. It's going to get louder. A lot louder. His attorneys are going to go after everything. Your source for the kidnapping intelligence, your communication with Do-hwan, everything. I know. You're sure you want to push this far. She thought about the 63-year-old woman in the grand jury room who had gone past, crying. She thought about 47 families. She thought about a warehouse south of Seattle that smelled like diesel akit and cold concrete, and the sound of Zuri saying, "Mommy." Push everything we have, she said. Do it now. The afternoon session lasted until 5:40. The defense called a second witness, a corporate compliance officer from Hanul Pacific's legitimate shipping operations, who testified to the separation between the company's legal activities and the subsidiary financial structure under investigation. He was credible in the narrow lane he had been given, and Imani cross-examined him efficiently, establishing that the separation he described was procedural rather than operational, and that the same corporate officers appeared in both structures at key decision points. It was good cross-examination. She knew it, and the jury knew it, and Hartwell knew it. What she also knew, and Hartwell also knew, was that the defense's entire afternoon strategy had been based on a playbook that had been written against a prosecution argument they had already seen, and she had shifted the argument. They were fighting the battle they had prepared for. She was fighting a different one. At 5:58, she sat in a conference room on the 4th floor of the federal building, across from 2 criminal defense attorneys she had never met before, with Reyes beside her and a recorder running, and the particular institutional stillness of a room where something important was about to be said. The attorneys were named Pollard and Chi. Their clients were cooperating separately, handled by separate counsel deliberately. Both attorneys had done this before. Imani laid out the proffer parameters clearly and without preamble, because clarity at this stage was a form of respect, and she needed these people to understand she was not going to waste their time. What she heard in the next 40 minutes was detailed, consistent, and specific enough to be credible. Park Sung-jin had been planning the pressure operation against the Haneul Pacific prosecution for 6 weeks before the kidnapping. He had identified Imani as the critical node, remove the prosecutor, destabilize the case structure, create grounds for mistrial or reassignment. The kidnapping had been his final option after a series of attempts to slow the prosecution through legal delays, witness intimidation, and the Whitmer placement had collectively failed to produce the result he needed. He had authorized it from his primary commercial real estate office in downtown Seattle in a room with 3 other people, 10 days before Zuri was taken. One of those 3 people was still walking free. His name was Thomas Yoon, and he was Park Sung-jin's domestic operations coordinator, and according to the cooperating witnesses, he had managed the logistics of the kidnapping, personally the team selection, the timing, the extraction from Imani's apartment. "Where is Yoon now?" Imani said. Pollard and she looked at each other briefly. "That's the problem," Reyes said from beside her. "We've been running his name since this morning." His apartment was cleared out. His phone went dark 40 hours ago. 40 hours ago is before Whitmer resigned, yes. So someone warned him before the breach was even discovered. Yes. She looked at the table. Park Sung-jin has a second information source. Not Whitmer. Whitmer was targeted at the prosecution. There's someone else positioned differently, watching for any indication the Park investigation was going to open. That's what it looks like. Which means he knew we were coming before we knew we were going. The room was quiet. She pressed her palms flat against the table that gesture. Again, she noted it again, and made herself think through the architecture of what she was looking at. Park Sung-jin had built a monitoring operation around both sides of the legal proceeding simultaneously. He had a source inside the prosecution team and a source watching for law enforcement movement on his own operation. When the prosecution source was burned, the second source activated and Yoon disappeared. It was a sophisticated operation, more sophisticated than she had given him credit for. "We need Yoon," she said. "Without Yoon, the cooperating witness's testimony is strong but contestable. Yoon is the direct operational link." "We're running every contact we have," Reyes said. "Run them faster." She stood up and expanded the search parameters. If he was warned 40 hours ago, he had time to get out of the state. Coordinate with field offices in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Vancouver, and check port records for the last 48 hours. He has connections to freight infrastructure. He knows how goods disappear. She gathered her things. "Ms. Caldwell," Pollard, the first attorney, spoke as she reached the door. "My client wanted me to ask the proffer agreement. Timeline on protection arrangements. I'll have the paperwork to you by 9 tomorrow morning." She opened the door. "Tell your client to stay comfortable and stay available. This is going to move fast." It moved fast. Reyes called her at 7:40 the following morning, 40 minutes before she needed to leave for court. Yoon is in Vancouver. Canadian Border Services flagged his name overnight. He crossed at the Peace Arch on a secondary identity 41 hours ago. RCMP picked him up at 6 a.m. local time. He had a one-way ferry ticket to Vancouver Island and approximately $80,000 in mixed currency. Imani was standing in her kitchen. The coffee in her hand was still hot. Extradition. Emergency provisional arrest request is already filed. The U.S. Attorney's Office in the Western District of Washington is coordinating with Canadian federal authorities. Given the nature of the charges and the existing treaty framework, we're looking at days, not weeks. She took a drink of the coffee. It was too hot, and she didn't feel it. And Keene, his office called 20 minutes ago. The independent forensic examiner confirmed the fabrication. 7 specific markers of document manufacture, all consistent with a controlled production environment, meaning not a scan of a genuine document, but a fabricated original built to look authentic. Keene is ruling this afternoon. Park Sung-jin's motion is being dismissed, and Garland is being referred for a bar inquiry. Garland knew. He should have known. Whether he knew or chose not to look carefully enough is the bar inquiry's problem. A pause. The referral alone is going to cost him. She set the coffee down. Outside the kitchen window, Seattle was doing what it did on November morning's low cloud cover. The particular gray that wasn't threatening, but wasn't comfortable either. The kind of light that made everything look like it was being evaluated. "We're filing the expanded indictment," she said. "The paperwork is ready. Park Sung-jin, conspiracy to obstruct federal prosecution, kidnapping with federal jurisdiction, accessory charges on the original financial crimes case. We can file by noon. File at 9. I want it in before I walk into that courtroom." "That's aggressive." "Yes." She picked up her briefcase. "I know." She walked into courtroom 7 at 8:59, with the expanded indictment filed, and Keen's ruling issued, and Yoon in Canadian custody, and the rebuilt prosecution strategy organized in her briefcase in a sequence that bore almost no resemblance to the strategy that had existed 4 days ago. She set her briefcase on the prosecution table. She took out her exhibits. She sat down, and for the first time in 4 days, she looked directly at Do-hwan. He was already watching her. He had the look of a man who had spent the night processing something, not the legal situation. She understood the legal situations had its own separate weight. Something else. Something in the quality of his attention that was different from the controlled professional watchfulness he maintained in court. More direct, less managed. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she opened her exhibit packet and looked at the first document. Hartwell leaned toward Do-hwan and said something in a low voice. Do-hwan didn't respond immediately. He was still looking at the prosecution table. Then he turned to his attorney and listened. Whatever Hartwell told him, it produced a stillness in Do-hwan that was different from his usual courtroom composure. The kind of stillness that happened when information arrived that required fundamental reassessment. She understood, without being told, that Hartwell had informed him about the expanded indictment, about Park Sung-jin's formal charging, about the fact that the information Do-hwan had provided the communication logs. The identified fabrications had been used not just to counter the misconduct motion, but to build an entirely new criminal case against the man who had used Do-hwan's financial infrastructure for the past 6 years. She waited. Judge Wynn entered, and the room rose, and the session was called to order. Hartwell requested permission to address the court before testimony resumed. Wynn granted it. "Your Honor," Hartwell said, "the defense requests a brief recess. My client has information he wishes to provide to the prosecution, and we believe that information is material to the proceedings in a way that requires a modification of our current posture." The room's atmosphere shifted. Imani kept her face exactly where it was. "How long a recess?" Wynn said. "1 hour, Your Honor." Wynn looked at Imani. "The prosecution has no objection," she said. Wynn gavelled the recess. In the private conference rooms adjacent to courtroom 7, Imani sat across the table from Do-hwan and his full legal team for the first time in 11 months of prosecution. Hartwell opened a binder and placed it in the center of the table. "My client," Hartwell said, "wishes to provide the prosecution with a complete record of Park Sung-jin's financial operations as conducted through Hanul Pacific's subsidiary structure over the past 6 years. This includes transaction records, account identifiers, business relationships, and internal communications that document the full scope of Park's activity. Additionally, my client is prepared to provide testimony regarding the nature and extent of his knowledge of and involvement in operations he did not authorize but failed to prevent." He slid the binder across the table. Imani put her hand on it. "Your client understands," she said, "that cooperation of this nature doesn't restructure the existing charges against him." "He understands that. He is still facing 7 counts with the existing evidence." "He understands that as well." She looked at Do-hwan directly. He was looking back at her with the same quality of attention he had always brought to the moments that mattered everything present, nothing withheld. "Then why?" she said. "Nah, not a legal question." She knew it wasn't a legal question, and the attorneys on both sides of the table knew it wasn't a legal question, and nobody interrupted it. Do-hwan leaned forward slightly. His hands were flat on the table. Because there are people who should have been stopped a long time ago, he said. And I had the information to stop them, and I made choices that protected my own position instead. That's what this is about. It's not about my case. It's not about reducing anything. A pause. It's about what I should have done 6 years ago. Imani looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the binder. What she found inside was not a summary. It was not a curated selection of documents chosen to minimize his own exposure while maximizing Park's. It was a complete record, the kind that only existed if the person compiling it had made a decision to provide everything without editing for self-interest. It was, she understood within the first 5 minutes of review, enough to dismantle Park Sung-jin's operation at a structural level that would take years to rebuild. It was also enough to confirm, in significant additional detail, Do-hwan's own culpability in operations he had authorized over the same 6-year period. He knew that. He had handed her both. She looked up from the binder. Across the table, Do-hwan was watching her read, with the expression of a man who had made a decision he was not going to take back. She thought about what she needed to say to him. Not professionally, personally. The thing that had been building pressure in her chest for 3 weeks and was now at a level that had nothing to do with trial strategy or legal ethics or professional composure. She thought about Zuri's eyes. She closed the binder. "We'll need a formal proffer agreement," she said, "and I'll require your client's testimony to be available before sentencing." She kept her voice level and her face professional, and her hands still on the table. "I can have the framework to your office by end of day." Hartwell nodded. "That's acceptable." She stood. The attorneys on both sides of the table gathered their materials. Do-hwan didn't move immediately. When the room had mostly cleared, when it was down to the two of them, and Hartwell on his side, and Reyes, who had come in quietly 10 minutes ago, on hers, Do-hwan looked at Imani and said, quietly, "There's something I need to say to you." Hartwell put a hand on Do-hwan's arm. Professional caution. Don't speak to opposing counsel outside the structured framework. Do-hwan looked at his attorney's hand. Then he looked at Imani. "Whatever you need to say," she said, "goes through your attorney's office in writing." She picked up the binder. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Do-hwan say her name. Just her name. The way he had always said it, like it was specific information, like it contained more data than 2 syllables should. She stopped walking. She stood at the door with her hand on the frame and the binder under her arm, and the rest of the day laid out in front of her, the resumed session, the proffer agreement, the expanded indictment, the Park Sung-jin prosecution, everything that still needed to be done. And she felt very clearly, and without any available defense against it, the full weight of everything she had not said to him in 5 years, pressing against the back of her sternum. She turned around. "Mr. Seo," she said carefully, "the court is going to reconvene in 40 minutes. I suggest you use the time to confer with your legal team." He looked at her. "After the verdict," he said. "Not a question. Not a negotiation. Just a statement of intention." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. "After the verdict," she said. She walked out the door and down the hallway and into the women's restroom on the 2nd floor. Skeedines. And she stood at the sink with the water running cold over her wrists and looked at herself in the mirror and breathed until the pressure in her chest settled back to something she could contain. 40 minutes. She had 40 minutes before she walked back into that courtroom and continued the prosecution that was going to end with a guilty verdict against the man who had spent the last 3 weeks proving, without intending to, that he was capable of something she had decided 5 years ago he was not. She turned off the water. She dried her hands. She picked up the binder. And she walked back toward the courtroom, toward the verdict, a sound like green wood splitting, toward everything that was waiting on the other side of it, with the knowledge that the hardest conversation of her life was not the one she'd been having in court for 4 weeks, but the one she still had not had and could no longer justify avoiding. The resumed session lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Imani did not look at the clock. She knew the time because Judge Wynn called recesses at precise intervals, and she tracked them the way she tracked everything during trial, not consciously, but with the background awareness of someone whose professional survival had always depended on knowing where she was in a sequence. She presented 3 additional exhibits from the rebuilt prosecution framework: financial authorization records, 2 internal corporate communications, and a transfer document that the defense's forensic accountant had not seen and could not have prepared for. Hartwell objected twice. Both objections were overruled. The cross-examination of the defense's third witness, a former Hanul Pacific compliance officer who had been going to testify that the subsidiary structure was a standard industry configuration, lasted 40 minutes and ended with the witness acknowledging, reluctantly and in specific terms, that the configuration she had described as standard included mechanisms that had no legitimate operational purpose. The jury watched all of it. Imani had been watching juries for 11 years. She understood their attention the way a musician understood an audience, not by looking directly, but through peripheral awareness, through the quality of the room's breathing, through the small physical signals that accumulated into a picture. By the time Wynne gavelled the session to closed at 4:47, she understood that the picture had shifted in a direction that was not good for the defense. She packed her briefcase with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done it hundreds of times and whose hands knew the sequence without being asked. Hartwell approached her as the gallery cleared. "We'll have the proffer framework reviewed by end of week," he said. He was being professional. That was appropriate, and she matched it. "My office will have the initial draft to you tomorrow morning." She closed the briefcase clasp. "The cooperation timeline will need to align with the sentencing schedule." "Understood," he paused. "For what it's worth, Miss Caldwell, what you've built here the case. It's serious work." She looked at him. Coming from Hartwell, who had been in federal litigation since she was in law school, and who did not produce compliments for strategic reasons, it was a genuine statement. "Thank you," she said. She walked out. The closing arguments took 2 days. Imani had written and rewritten hers 4 times. The final version was 61 pages of notes that she did not read from. She never read from notes in closing. Sounds like need see, because the jury needed to see that she believed what she was saying rather than reciting it, but that she had absorbed until the structure was instinct. She stood in front of the jury on a gray Thursday morning, and she talked about money. Not about Seo Do-hwan specifically. Not at first. She talked about what money did when it moved through structures designed to make it invisible. She talked about the 47 families. She named 4 of them, with their permission, using the testimony they had given in depositions and grand jury proceedings. She talked about what $200,000 meant to a 63-year-old woman who had worked for 31 years and who was sitting in a 1-bedroom apartment now, instead of the house she had planned to retire to. Retirement account that was supposed to buy that house had been processed through a subsidiary transfer mechanism and emerged, months later, as a number on a spreadsheet in the Cayman Islands. She talked about choices. Not the choices of corporations or financial systems or abstract criminal enterprises. The choices of one specific man who had built one specific structure and had authorized, over 20 years, the specific decisions that had produced these specific outcomes for these specific people. She was precise about what Do-hwan had done. She was equally precise about what he had not done. She did not invent malice where the evidence showed negligence, did not claim certainty where the evidence showed probability, did not ask the jury to convict on anything she had not proven. She had proven enough. In the back of her mind, running parallel to the closing argument like a second track she was not currently playing aloud, was the knowledge of what Do-hwan had provided in the last 72 hours. The complete communication records, the financial documentation for Park Seung-jin's operation, the testimony framework that Hartwell had begun formalizing. She had not used any of it in the closing argument for this trial. This trial was about Do-hwan's conduct, and the evidence for that conduct had been built over 11 months before she ever knew he was the defendant. She was not going to allow what he had done subsequently to blur what he had done before. The jury needed to make its decision based on what the evidence showed. She stood in front of them for 2 hours and 20 minutes and made sure they could. The defense's closing was handled by Hartwell personally, and it was good. It was the best version of the argument available given the evidence, and it made every point that could reasonably be made about the complexity of corporate financial structures, the difficulty of attributing specific decisions to specific individuals in large organizations, and the distinction between aggressive business practice and criminal conduct. He was experienced and he was thorough, and he had a voice that juries found credible. He was working with what he had. The jury deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days. Imani spent the deliberation period at her office. Not waiting, she had learned early in her career that waiting for jury deliberation was a form of self-torture that produced no useful output, but working on the Park Sung-jin indictment, which had its own timeline and its own complexity, and kept her mind occupied in the productive direction. Reyes called twice with updates on Yoon's extradition proceedings. The Canadian federal process was moving. Thomas Yoon had retained Vancouver counsel and was contesting, which was expected, but the treaty framework was clear, and the contesting was going to cost him time and money rather than produce results. She ate lunch at her desk both days. She called Deja to check on Zuri both evenings. She did not sleep particularly well either night, but the reason was different from what it had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago she hadn't slept because of volume too much to process, too many variables, the constant background hum of a case that was trying to come apart in multiple directions simultaneously. Now the case was where it was, and the verdict was what it was going to be. She couldn't change it. The not sleeping was about something else. About 40 minutes past 2 on the second afternoon of deliberation, her phone rang with the court clerk's number. The jury had a verdict. She was in the courtroom in 22 minutes. The gallery was fuller than it had been to view any session of the trial. Word had moved the way word moved in legal circles quickly through informal channels, in a way that couldn't be exactly traced but produced results with consistency. The press section was at capacity. Several attorneys she recognized from other federal cases had found seats in the public gallery. She sat at the prosecution table and arranged her materials in the order she had arranged them every morning for 4 weeks. And she did not look at the defense table. And then she changed her mind and looked at it anyway. Because not looking had been a form of management she no longer needed to perform. Do-hwan sat in the same posture he had maintained throughout the trial, spine straight, hands quiet on the table, expression arranged in its controlled register. His suit today was navy. His attorneys flanked him. He was looking at the front of the courtroom, at the bench that was still empty, at the space where Judge Wynn would appear in the next few minutes. He looked exactly as composed as he always looked. But she was close enough, and she knew him well enough, to see the thing beneath the composure that he was managing very hard. Not fear of the verdict, she didn't think it was that. Do-hwan had built his entire adult life on the understanding that actions produced consequences and consequences were managed, not avoided. The verdict was a consequence. She didn't think he was afraid of it. It was something else. Something in the way he held himself that she associated from her 4 months of knowing as a private person rather than a defendant, with the particular cost of waiting for something that mattered to him in a way he hadn't fully accounted for. She looked away before he turned. Judge Wynn entered. The room rose, guilty on 7 counts. The foreperson read each one in the flat, careful voice that jurors used when they understood the weight of what they were saying and were determined to carry it correctly. Financial fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. 4 additional counts related to the specific subsidiary operations Imani had documented in the rebuilt exhibit sequence. Not guilty on 2 counts, both related to operations where the evidence connected the activity to Park Sung-jin's network rather than Do-hwan's direct authorization. Imani had known those 2 were uncertain. The jury had been precise in their reading of the evidence, which was exactly what she had asked them to be. She sat at the prosecution table and listened to each count and kept her face neutral and her hands still. Across the room, Do-hwan received each verdict without visible reaction. He sat in the same posture. His hands did not move. When the foreperson finished, he turned to Hartwell and said something brief. Hartwell nodded. Judge Wynn thanked the jury, set a sentencing date, and addressed both parties on the standard post-verdict procedures. Then she gavelled the session closed. The room began to move and breathe differently, the particular release of energy that followed a verdict, the sound of journalists reaching for their phones, the rustle of the gallery. The attorneys on both sides beginning the mechanical process of gathering materials and transitioning into the next phase of their professional obligations. Imani began packing her briefcase. She was aware of the defense table clearing. She was aware of Do-hwan standing, of Hartwell speaking to him, of the marshals moving into position for the standard post-verdict procedure. She focused on her own materials, exhibit packets, notes, the case file that had lived in this briefcase for 11 months and was now in its trial phase, finished. Ms. Caldwell. Hartwell's voice. She looked up. He was standing at the edge of the prosecution table with his own briefcase already in hand. A sound like green splispling, and his expression carried the controlled professional acknowledgement of a man who had lost a case he'd known he was probably going to lose, but had fought completely anyway. My client would like a moment, he said, off the record. Before the marshals move him. He paused. I've advised against it. For what it's worth. Imani looked past him. Do-hwan was standing beside the defense table. The marshals were a few feet away, giving the moment whatever space they were going to give it. The gallery was still clearing. There were people around, but the immediate space had thinned. She had told him after the verdict. She picked up her briefcase. 5 minutes, she said to Hartwell. Hartwell stepped away. She walked to the defense table. She stopped at a distance that was professional and looked at Do-hwan and waited. Because whatever he wanted to say, she was going to let him say it first. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You built a good case." "I built an honest case," she said. "There's a difference." "Yes." A pause. "You could have used the additional documentation I provided to modify the charges. Weight them differently. You didn't. You're convicted of what the evidence proved you did. Not less. Not more, I know." He looked at the table briefly, then back at her. "I want you to know that I didn't cooperate to affect the outcome here. I cooperated because it was what should have happened 6 years ago, and I was not capable of it then." "I know that," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the particular quality of attention that appeared when information arrived that he had not expected. "You knew that," he said. "Yes. And you proceeded anyway." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because the 47 families whose money moved through your network deserved a verdict based on the evidence. Not a verdict shaped by what you did afterward. You don't get credit in this courtroom for who you decided to be in November. This courtroom was about who you decided to be over the last 20 years. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, not defensively, not with the resistance of someone who had expected different treatment, but with the specific quality of a man receiving something accurate that was going to cost him and accepting the cost. "That's fair," he said. "I know." The marshals were moving closer. The 5 minutes were almost up. "I have a daughter," she said. She had not planned the timing. She had thought about this moment, for 3 weeks had constructed various versions of it, various contexts and settings and framings, and none of those versions had been this one. Standing in a half-empty courtroom 40 seconds after a guilty verdict with marshals 10 feet away. But the timing was what it was, and she had spent 5 years waiting for a moment that never arrived on its own terms, and she was done waiting. Do-hwan looked at her. "Her name is Zuri," Imani said. "She's 4 years old. She has your eyes." The courtroom, which was not silent, became silent in the way that spaces became silent when something occurred that restructured the atmosphere of the room. She watched him receive it, watched the information land and propagate through his expression in a way that his composure could not fully contain, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, the kind that happened when the framework you had been operating inside shifted so fundamentally that the operating system needed a moment to catch up. The age. She could see him running the math. She could see it arriving. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "The night she was taken," he said. His voice was different. Still controlled, but different underneath, like something below, the controlled register, had changed temperature. "That's why. You should have." He stopped. "Started differently. I should have known." "You couldn't have known." I made sure you couldn't. Why? Because you told me you weren't capable of being what we needed. And I believed you. She kept her voice level. I believed you completely. I made my decisions based on that. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not guilt was too simple, too self-focused. Something more like a man looking at the full, accurate cost of a decision he had made without understanding what he was deciding. Was I right, he said? Was I right to say that? She thought up Zuri in the warehouse. She thought about Zuri eating cereal with stars and declaring the crisis over. She thought about Zuri's face in the half-light, saying you're still up, and the way she had gone back to sleep with the complete trust of a child who understood at a cellular level that her mother was solid. You were right about who you were, Imani said. Whether you're still that person is a question I can't answer for you. The marshals arrived at the edge of their space. Do-hwan looked at her for one more moment. She let him look. After sentencing, he said, "We'll see," she said. "That depends on what sentencing looks like and what comes after it." He nodded. Once. The kind of nod that meant understood and accepted, not agreed with, not made peace with, just received. The marshals moved him out. Imani stood at the defense table alone, for a moment in the emptying courtroom, and she thought about what she had just done and whether it had been the right time, and concluded that there was no right time for something like that, which meant this time was as valid as any other. She picked up her briefcase. She walked out. Park Sung-jin was arrested 9 days after Do-hwan's verdict. The arrest occurred at his downtown Seattle office at 7:40 in the morning, before his staff arrived. Reyes had timed it specifically, 2 federal agents and a U.S. Marshal, warrant in hand, while Seattle was still deciding whether to be awake. The lawyers arrived within 40 minutes, but they arrived to a situation that was already processed and documented and conducted without incident. Imani was not there. She was in her office reviewing the sentencing memorandum when Reyes sent the confirmation text. She read it, set her phone face down on the desk, and returned to the memorandum. Thomas Yoon was extradited 3 weeks later. His Vancouver counsel had mounted a credible procedural challenge that cost 31 days and roughly $200,000 in legal fees and produced no change in outcome. He arrived at SeaTac Airport on a gray Tuesday afternoon and was processed with the thoroughness that his 31 days of resistance had earned from the people waiting for him. The 2 cooperating witnesses from the warehouse gave their testimony in the subsequent Park Sung-jin proceedings. Both received reduced sentences. Both testified clearly, consistently, and in a way that corroborated the documentary evidence that Do-hwan's communication records had provided. Park Sung-jin's legal team mounted the defense that expensive legal teams mounted when the evidence was comprehensive procedural challenges, evidentiary objections, a counter-narrative built on the minimum viable material. It produced delays. It did not produce a different outcome. The restitution process for the 47 families began 4 months after Do-hwan's verdict. Supplemented, funded through the seized assets of the financial network and supplemented by civil judgments against the corporate structure that had served as the laundering vehicles. It was not complete restitution, it never was. Money that had been missing for years returned in portions through a process that required documentation and patience and the particular endurance of people who had already spent a long time being patient about something that should not have required their patience. The 63-year-old woman, whose testimony Imani had heard in the grand jury room, received partial restitution 11 months later. She sent a brief letter to the U.S. Attorney's Office, addressed to no one in particular, that said, "Thank you," and nothing else. Imani read it and put it in a file she kept that was not part of any official record. Do-hwan was sentenced on a Friday in February. The courtroom was quieter than it had been for the trial. The press was there, fewer of them, but the ones who were there were the ones who had been following the case from the beginning and understood what they were attending. The gallery held a fraction of the trial's audience. Imani sat at the prosecution table and presented the sentencing recommendation with the same precision she had brought to every other phase of the case. She did not advocate for maximum sentencing, and she did not advocate for leniency. She presented the evidence of harm caused, the evidence of cooperation provided, and the recommendation that reflected the full and accurate accounting of both. Judge Wynn sentenced Do-hwan to 11 years. The cooperation credit was applied. The nature and extent of the cooperation, the Park Sung-jin material, the communication record, the testimony, provided in subsequent proceedings, was acknowledged in Wynn's sentencing statement with the specificity it warranted. It had been material. It had produced results that extended well beyond the original Hanul Pacific case. It did not change what had been done over 20 years. 11 years with credit for time served in pretrial detention and the standard eligibility considerations that applied to cooperative defendants in federal sentencing. Hanul Pacific Logistics was placed under independent management through a federal oversight arrangement that severed it completely from Do-hwan's control and from any connection to the criminal organization that had operated beneath it. The company's legitimate shipping operation continued. 340 employees kept their jobs. The company would be monitored for 5 years. The mafia empire, the actual structure, the relationships, the operational network that had taken 20 years to build along the Pacific coast was finished. The Park Sung-jin prosecution had exposed its deepest connections. The cooperation materials had allowed federal authorities to reach partners and associates that the original Hanul Pacific investigation had not known to look for. It dismantled over 18 months, piece by piece, with the thoroughness that only comprehensive inside knowledge could produce. Imani was not in court for the final Park Sung-jin verdict. She had a conflict with a different case, a different prosecution, a different set of evidence, a different defendant, the ongoing work of her office that did not pause because one major case had reached its conclusion. She got the text from Reyes while she was in a deposition. She read it under the table and typed back one word, good. Then she put her phone away and finished the deposition. Spring arrived in Seattle the way it usually did, with ambivalence, cold rain giving way to almost warmth and then retreating, the cherry trees along certain streets blooming with determined optimisms, despite temperatures that hadn't fully committed to the season yet. Zuri turned 5 in March. Deja threw her a party with the talking dog cartoon theme that Zuri had been requesting for 4 months, and 6 children from her preschool class destroyed a living room with the enthusiastic completeness that 5-year-olds brought to celebrations. And Imani stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room with a cup of coffee and watched her daughter navigate the chaos of her own birthday with the particular combination of authority and delight that Zuri brought to most situations. She had Do-hwan's focus, the capacity for complete attention when something interested her. She had Imani's stubbornness in a form that was slightly worse. These were not abstract observations. They were things Imani had been sitting with for months, with the slow, unsentimental honesty she brought to things she was trying to understand rather than manage. After the party, after the other children had been collected by their parents, and Deja had gone home, and Zuri had been bathed and put to bed, and the living room had been restored to something approaching its normal configuration, Imani sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and her laptop open to a document she had been writing in pieces for 2 months. It was a letter. Not to Do-hwan directly, there were legal and logistical frameworks around contact with incarcerated individuals that she was going to navigate correctly, because navigating things correctly was not optional for her, even when it was inconvenient. The letter was addressed to Hartwell's office, to be routed through the appropriate channels. It outlined, in careful and specific terms, what she was willing to discuss, what the boundaries of any future communication would be, and what her expectations were regarding the process. It also contained, at the end, 2 paragraphs that were not legal or logistical. She read them again now. She had written them at 2 in the morning 6 weeks ago when Zuri was asleep, and the apartment was quiet, and she had run out of professional framing and arrived at the thing underneath it. She had edited them twice. They still didn't say everything she meant. She had decided that was acceptable, that the gap between what she meant and what she was capable of writing was its own kind of honest communication. She sent the letter. She closed the laptop. She finished the water and rinsed the glass and turned off the kitchen light and went to check on Zuri before she went to bed, which was what she did every night. which would continue to be what she did every night, regardless of what else changed or didn't change. Zuri was asleep on her side, with the stuffed elephant under one arm and her hair spread across the pillow in the way it went when she'd been active immediately before sleeping, which she had been. One small hand was curled near her chin. Her breathing was the deep, uncomplicated breathing of a child who had decided the day was finished. Amansi stood in the doorway for a moment. She did not resolve, standing there, all of the things that remained unresolved. The questions about what the next few years would look like, what contact would mean, and what it wouldn't mean, what Zuri would eventually be told, and when and in what words, and whether those words would be adequate to the thing they were trying to convey. She did not resolve any of it, because those things were not problems to be solved in a single moment in a doorway. They were situations to be lived through with the same ongoing, imperfect attention that everything else required. She had learned, over 5 years of doing it alone, that some things didn't resolve. They developed. Sometimes in directions you hadn't planned for. Sometimes toward things that looked different from what you had expected and turned out to be sufficient anyway. She pulled Zuri's door to a comfortable angle and went to bed. 14 months after Do-hwan's sentencing, on a Saturday morning when Seattle had finally committed to being warm, Imani drove to a federal correctional facility 40 minutes south of the city. She drove alone. She had thought about bringing Deja for support and decided against it because this was not a situation where support in the conventional sense was what was needed. What was needed was clarity, and she was better at clarity alone. The facility's visiting procedures were thorough and took 40 minutes to complete. She had done the paperwork weeks in advance. She sat in the waiting area and read a document she had brought from the office and did not think about what she was about to do, because thinking about it further was not going to change it. The visiting room was institutional in the way that all institutional spaces were institutional functional, deliberately plain, designed to serve a purpose without providing comfort that might obscure the nature of the situation. Round tables, chairs that were stable and impersonal, windows that admitted light without view. Do-hwan was already at the table when she came through. 14 months. He looked different in the specific ways that 14 months in a federal facility made people look different, sharper in some ways, the way people got sharper when their environment removed all the ornamental layers of regular life. The suit was gone. He wore the facility's clothing with the same posture he had worn everything else, which was its own kind of information about the nature of posture. He looked at her when she sat down. She had prepared for this. She had thought through what she wanted to say, in the order she wanted to say it. She had been a federal prosecutor for 11 years, and she understood the value of entering a consequential conversation with a structure. She looked at him, and the structure went somewhere. She couldn't immediately retrieve it. "You look like you've been working," he said. She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter. Always. The park sentencing. 18 years, she said. The kidnapping charges added significant weight above the financial crimes. He nodded. Yoon. 14 years. He cooperated eventually. Took him a while to decide it was worth it. She paused. He'll be out before Park. I know. A pause of his own. The restitution process. Moving slowly. But moving, she looked at the table briefly, then back at his face. The families are getting something. Not everything. Something, because of you. Because of the work, she said. It's not the same thing. He accepted that with the same quality of acceptance he had brought to everything she had told him. That was accurate and difficult. It was, she had realized over the past 14 months of intermittent letters, and one phone call conducted through the approved channel, one of the things she had underestimated about him. He did not resist accurate information. He was one of the few people she had ever known who was genuinely, constitutionally capable of receiving something true and allowing it to change his framework, rather than defending the framework against it. It made him, in certain ways, easier to talk to than people with better histories. I brought something, she said. She reached into the bag she had carried through security, which had been inspected thoroughly and cleared, and she placed a photograph on the table. It was Zuri at her 5th birthday party, standing in the middle of the destroyed living room with her birthday crown slightly askew, and both fists in the air, in the gesture she made when she was pleased with a situation, and her face wearing the particular expression that she wore when she had decided something was completely good. Do-hwan looked at the photograph. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way he looked at things he was absorbing rather than merely seeing. She watched him look at it. She watched the thing that moved through his face, not one emotion, but a sequence of them, moving too fast for any of them to fully surface, like weather systems passing through in compressed time. He picked up the photograph. He held it, the way people held things they were not sure they were allowed to hold and were holding anyway. "She looks like she runs everything," he said. "She does run everything," Imani said. "She is currently running the preschool social structure with a level of strategic sophistication that I find both impressive and concerning." Something moved across his face that was, she realized, a version of the smile she had seen 4 times in 4 months 5 years ago, private, unperformed. The expression he produced when something struck him as genuinely good. She had not expected to see it here. She had not expected it to produce the particular sensation it produced in her chest, which was something between recognition and grief, and something else she didn't have an exact name for. "She has your focus," Imani said. "When something interests her, the rest of the world stops existing. I've watched her spend 45 minutes on a puzzle that was rated for ages 8 and up." "How old was she?" For a pause. "She finished it." He set the photograph down with a care that was not careful in the deliberate way it was careful. In the automatic way, the way hands handled things they had decided were important before the brain had formally made the decision. "What does she know?" he said. "About me." "She knows your name," Imani said. "She knows you're her father. She knows you made mistakes that you're dealing with the consequences of." She paused. "I didn't give her a version she'll have to unlearn later. I gave her something true that she can add to as she gets older and can absorb more of it." "How did she take it?" Imani thought about the conversation. The kitchen table. Zuri with her cereal going soft in the bowl, listening with the focused attention that she brought to things she had decided were important. "She asked if you were like the people who took her," Imani said. "I told her it was complicated, and that I would explain more when she was ready for more, and that the short answer was no." She thought about it for a while, and then she asked if you were going to come to her next birthday party. She paused. "I told her I didn't know." She said okay and finished her cereal. Do-hwan looked at the table. "She's going to be something," he said. "Yes," Imani agreed. "She is." A silence that had a quality to it that was different from the silences in the courtroom, different from the silences in her apartment at midnight. A silence that had weight but not pressure. The kind that existed between people who had said the necessary difficult things and were now sitting in what remained afterward. "I got your letters," he said. "I know. Hartwell forwards the confirmations." "The last one." He looked at her steadily. "The last 2 paragraphs." She had known they would arrive at this. She had known it, and she had come anyway, which was its own kind of statement. "I wrote what I meant," she said. "I'm not going to edit it retroactively. You said you weren't sure this was something that could be rebuilt." "I said I wasn't sure it should be rebuilt the way it was," she said. "What existed before, fiddle, that was 2 people who were not honest with each other about what they needed. I wasn't honest with you about what I wanted, and you weren't honest with yourself about what you were capable of. That's not a foundation. That's 2 people who were comfortable together in ways that didn't account for the full cost." And now she looked at him. "Now I know the full cost. And I know what you chose when the cost was visible." She paused. "That's not nothing. I'm not going to pretend it's nothing. But you have 9.5 more years," she said. "And I have a daughter who needs a version of this that is handled with extreme care and patience and absolutely no rushing. And I have a career that requires me to maintain boundaries that are real and not performed. And I am not a person who decides what a situation is before I have enough information." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a no," he said. "That's not a yes," she said. "That's an honest answer." He accepted it. She watched him accept it, not with resignation, and not with hope exactly, but with the particular quality of a man who had learned, at significant cost, the difference between what he wanted a situation to be and what it actually was. "She can write to me," he said. Zuri, if she wants to. When she's ready. He paused. I'm not asking for anything that costs her something. I'm not asking for anything at all. I'm saying if she wants to know me, I'll be here. Imani looked at him for a long moment. I'll tell her, she said. She picked up the photograph and slid it back to him. He looked at it. Keep it, she said. She drove back to Seattle in the late morning light, which had arrived fully by now, the kind of sharp spring brightness that made the city look cleaner than it usually was. She drove the highway with both hands on the wheel and the radio off and the window, down 2 inches, the cold air moving through the car with the particular freshness that came after rain. She thought about the drive and the room and the photograph on the table. She thought about what she had said and what she hadn't said, and whether the balance between them was right, and decided it probably was as right as it was going to be, for now. She thought about Zuri, who was with Dija this morning, probably watching the Talking Dog cartoon and negotiating for a second bowl of the cereal with stars. She thought about the 63-year-old woman's letter. 2 words. Thank you. The complete accounting of what restitution could and couldn't do, in 2 words. She thought about what it meant to build something honest after something that had not been. She took the exit for the bridge, grieve, and crossed into the city and drove through neighborhoods that were waking up on a Saturday morning with the ordinary, unhurried energy of people who did not have anywhere they urgently needed to be. She stopped at a bakery 2 blocks from her apartment. She got a coffee and 2 almond croissants, one for her, one for Zuri, who had last month decided that almond croissants were the best thing that had ever existed, and that it was important for Imani to know this at frequent intervals. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, with the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for many years and had made peace with most of the things that work required. She smiled when Imani paid and said, "Have a good one," in the automatic way of people who worked serviced jobs and had learned to mean it anyway. "You too," Imani said. She carried the coffee and the bag out into the bright morning and walked the 2 blocks home. Dija buzzed her in without Imani having to ring. She had been watching from the window, which was a Dija habit that Imani had stopped finding excessive about 3 years ago. The elevator was slow. She took the stairs. Zuri heard the door. She appeared in the hallway with the stuffed elephant under one arm and her hair in the 2 puffs that Dija always managed better than Imani did. And she looked at the bag and then at Imani with the particular expression that combined hope and certainty in the ratio that only people who had been given almond croissants many times could produce. "Is that?" "Yes." Zuri performed the fists in the air gesture that the birthday photograph had captured. Imani set the coffee down on the hallway table and crouched and pulled Zuri into a hug that she held for slightly longer than the croissant delivery situation technically required, and Zuri hugged her back with the automatic, uncomplicated force of a child who had not yet learned to ration affection, and who had, Imani thought, who had inherited something from her father after all, in this particular way, this capacity for complete and unguarded presence when the moment was right. "You okay, Mommy?" Imani leaned back and looked at her daughter's face. "Yeah," she said, "I'm okay." Zuri studied her with Do-hwan's eyes, which was a thing Imani had learned to receive as simply true, not a wound, not a complication, just a fact about the person her daughter was, which was a person who was entirely herself and no one else's echo. "Can we eat them at the window?" Zuri said. "The sun is doing the thing." "What thing?" "The sparkly thing on the water." Imani looked toward the living room, where the morning light was coming through the glass at the angle that hit the small strip of Elliott Bay visible between the buildings and made it look, for about 40 minutes on clear mornings, like something worth stopping for. "Yeah," she said, "we can eat them at the window." She took Zuri's hand, and they went to watch the light on the water and ate the croissants. And the city moved around them with its ordinary Saturday energy, unhurried and sufficient. And the trial was over, and the empire was gone, and the secret was no longer a secret, and the morning was just a morning, which was, after everything, exactly what it needed to be.